Hello, welcome. Thank you for coming. The Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, Subcommittee on Children and Families will please come to order. This afternoon we're having a hearing on EpiPen price increases. I think it's important when you get upset about something or when you see a problem that you try to scratch beyond the surface and see what the origin of the problem is and try to fully understand it before we react and try to fix it. I'd like to thank the University of Kentucky, the UK College of Pharmacy, and UK Healthcare for hosting this subcommittee hearing. When I first heard about the EpiPen price increases, going up 500%, I was like anybody else, outraged. I have allergic reactions to bees and have had to use epinephrine when I was a kid, and many families have that sort of experience. And they hate to think of sort of a life-saving drug having, a 5%. They just don't understand, why does it cost 500% more, particularly when the ingredients are quite inexpensive. The ingredients of the epinephrine's been around for, maybe 100 years. It's about $1 worth of medication in there. And people, some have tried to say, well, it's a complicated device, all right? They haven't really been in a hospital, a modern hospital, if they think a spring-loaded needle is a complicated device. And so we've been exploring the question. We've had the FDA come in. We won't have them represented here today. It's kind of hard to get bureaucrats out of Washington, but we have interviewed them in the office, and we have some serious questions. Some of these questions we'll discuss here with the panel. One, they have a patent, and I'm for patents. That's intellectual property. It's one of the reasons why one of the great developers of things that require patents or intellectual property, like drugs. We're a leader in creating new drugs, innovative drugs. That's great. But patents can't last forever, and their patent will run out in 2025. They got it in 1987. So they're going to have a 38-year patent. And I think my understanding is the original patent's about 20 years, and how did it get to be 38 years? We want to know why there's no competition. Why is there only one person selling these? There is a generic. Well, there's many different generics, but there's at least one generic that applied 7 years ago. Is it a little too long to have the government take 7 years to approve things? And why does it take so long? And what can we do to speed up the process? So I think we ought to think about how long patents should be. I think we ought to think about how long the process should be. And then we ought to think about, how do other countries do it, and whether or not some other countries do it more quickly. One of the bills that we've introduced, it says if it's been approved in Europe and it's on the general market and there hasn't been any significant health or safety problem with it, then maybe we could dispense with all the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials and go directly to a committee that would still review the information, review it for safety and efficacy, but maybe not make the company start over, and that we could expedite this. Or maybe we should expedite things when there's only one person making something and the price goes up at an alarming pace. So I think there's a lot of good ideas. We've got people here from we have some patients in the audience who have allergies and have to buy the EpiPen. We have people who are involved with pharmacies selling the medication. We have economists and policymakers. So without any further ado, we're going to start by going around, and you can either make an opening statement, you can introduce yourself and make an opening comment, but I'm going to give you your choice, and then we'll proceed from there. But I'll begin by introducing Laura Jackson, who's the coordinator of the Kentucky Families with Food Allergies support group. Laura?
Thank you for inviting us today, and I hope I can give you a good perspective on what parents and families are going through.
Thank you. And if you want to make any more comment than that, you can now. We'll come back in a question and answer, but go ahead.
So
If you have a statement, go ahead.
I have been a food allergy parent for over 25 years, raising 2 sons with life-threatening food allergies. I know all too well the dangers of a severe allergic reaction, having witnessed it with my own child, watching my son's symptoms progress from mild to severe in a matter of seconds, seeing his labored breathing, the panic in his eyes, racing to the emergency room, and wondering if we could get there in time, knowing that a tragedy was possible, living with the fear of it happening again, and then worrying at every meal. These experiences inspired me to form the Kentucky Families with Food Allergies support group here in Lexington 10 years ago. There are many parents like me in our state, all facing the financial and emotional responsibilities that come from raising a child with a life-threatening condition. That is why Kentucky's food allergy parents are so concerned about the current EpiPen price increases. For over 15 years, my family purchased between 8 and 10 EpiPen 2-packs per year for our sons, who are now grown. We needed that many due to expiration dates and also to ensure that the injectors would always be within reach at home, when traveling, or at school, because prompt administration can make the difference between life and death. In 2013, we were thrilled to have a new option when the AviQ injector came onto the market. It was compact and much more user-friendly, so we switched to the AviQ when it was first introduced. In 2013, it cost my family roughly the same amount as the EpiPen injectors. But soon after, the EpiPen manufacturer began offering significant discounts so that EpiPens were less expensive than AviQ. Then AviQ offered discounts. I saw the cause and effect. Now that EpiPens had a competitor, they found a way to lower the price. 2 years later, in July of 2015, our insurance changed to a nearly unreachable $5,000 deductible, so we began paying the cash price. At that time, our cost for an EpiPen 2-pack or an AviQ 2-pack was virtually the same, about $390. But within a few months, there was a dramatic change in price. In October 2015, AviQ was recalled, and 2 months later, our cost for an EpiPen 2-pack shot up to well over $600. That was an increase of over $200. Since our insurance had not changed, I believe that the manufacturer was responsible. When I asked my pharmacist why the price had increased so dramatically, he said, quote, "They are the only game in town," end quote. It is my feeling that if Mylan had competition, the price would drop. Last year, we went looking for an alternative and were pleased to find the Adrenaclick generic auto-injector that cost us $116 for a 2-pack. It works a little differently than the EpiPen and is not an exact generic, and therefore my pharmacy and my allergist had never mentioned it. I believe the other reason that the Adrenaclick was never prescribed for my sons is the product's sporadic availability. Adrenaclick is manufactured by the American company Almeter Pharmaceuticals. At various points in time over the last several years, Almeter Pharmaceuticals has not been able to keep up with the demand. The situation is confusing for all involved, pharmacies, physicians, and consumers. Assuming the supply catches up soon, how do we make sure that consumers are aware of this lower cost option? My local school system is also affected. They tell me that fewer parents are sending EpiPens to keep at school due to the cost. This creates a dangerous situation. In Fayette County, each building has 4 stock EpiPens for emergency use, but they are intended to be a safety net for the undiagnosed or for students whose own EpiPen is, for some reason, not available. Those EpiPens stay in the building. That means students are riding on buses without EpiPens, going on field trips without EpiPens, walking home without EpiPens. In addition, an average of 1 in 13 children now have a food allergy, which is roughly 2 per classroom. The school's 4 stock EpiPens cannot possibly protect the entire student population. Parents need to continue to supply EpiPens for children with documented food allergies, but with skyrocketing costs, many parents can't. The high cost is putting children at risk. There are many families in our local support group who are struggling with this issue. Some parents are keeping EpiPens past the expiration date. Some parents are doing without. Many parents have told me that they're frustrated that one company has so much control. We need this life-saving medication to be sold at a reasonable price so that every child can be safe. Please allow more manufacturers to produce epinephrine injectors.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson. John Spencer is an independent pharmacist and the owner of Spencer Drugs.
Thank you, Senator Paul. As he said, my name is John Spencer, and I graduated from the University of Kentucky College of Pharmacy in 1992. I have worked in independent pharmacy since 1989, and I currently own 4 independent pharmacies. My staff and I are literally on the front lines of patient health care and provide education and information that is necessary for our patients to take their medications correctly in order to maximize their effectiveness in their treatment. Unfortunately, in the past few years, we find that we have become arbitrators between pharmaceutical manufacturers, pharmacy benefit managers, insurance companies, and patients. Too often, we have to attempt to explain huge price increases and formulary changes to a person that is sick and often in need of potential life-saving medication. And as you might imagine, these excuses are hard to come by. When talk of multi-million-dollar salaries for drug company executives is all over the news, it is really hard for my patients to understand when the price of their prescription increases by 500%. I am a businessman and I understand the free market. However, in the pharmaceutical industry, there are too many players with the ability to manipulate the system, and that is not at the heart of true capitalism or reasonable business ethics. I also understand that pharmaceutical companies with proprietary products need to make a profit and be paid for their research. But it appears that in many cases, these companies are choosing an increase in their stock price over an increase in accessibility of their profit to those who need the treatment the most. This industry has to be put under a different microscope when we evaluate their pricing practices. We're not dealing in sporting goods or appliances. We're dealing with products that can mean life and death for our patients. It is an inconvenient truth for the makers of EpiPen when we tell them about a local teacher with severe peanut allergies who finds out that her copay for her EpiPen is now $250. The last time I checked, most school teachers are not highly compensated, and the idea of having to replace this product year after year is not a pleasant thought. Mylan does not want to discuss about a mother from Tennessee whose child was starting kindergarten this year. She couldn't believe the price she had heard from her local pharmacy, so she started calling pharmacies in Kentucky in hopes of finding a cheaper price. Heather Bresch might be uncomfortable hearing about my colleague's patient with alpha-gal allergy, whose insurance copay was $626 because her deductible had to be met. Now, currently, you can go online to EpiPen.com and apply for our copay discount card, which may take up to $300 off your prescription in certain instances. In my 2 decades of work in pharmacy, I have no memory of any copay card offering such a staggering discount. But what I know is that if you can afford to offer a $300 discount, there's at least a $300 profit in your product. A 30 cc vial of epinephrine, as the senator was mentioning, which contains enough drug to make several EpiPens, probably in the neighborhood of 20, cost me $58.99. Therefore, it's really hard to believe that the active ingredient has a significant bearing on the cost of the product. Lawsuits, citizens' petitions, and backdoor payment deals between brand manufacturers and generic companies that are about to launch their products seem to be the norm. I guess this explains why some pharmacy benefit managers still choose to pay for products like Nexium and Crestor long after AB-rated generics exist, even though they are sometimes less than 5% of the cost of the brand name drug. On Mylan's website, under the heading Integrity, I quote, "Doing what's right is sacred to us. We behave responsibly, even when nobody is looking. We set high standards from which we never back down." End quote. My response to that would be, everyone is now looking, and we expect more responsible behavior. Thank you, Senator Paul.
Our next witness is Professor Brian K. Stroud, who is a PhD professor of economics at Western Kentucky University in my hometown of Bowling Green, and a BB&T professor for the study of capitalism.
Thank you, Senator Paul, for inviting me to testify before this committee today. I value any opportunity I have to talk about the values of competition generally, and in this case specifically as it applies to the pharmaceutical industry. So my comments today will revolve around the value of benefits, the value of competition generally to markets and to consumers specifically. I'll show some evidence of that value in the pharmaceutical industry specifically, explain barriers to this competition generally, why they might occur in general scenarios, but then also specifically why they're occurring in these specific drug markets. And then at the end, suggest some policy solutions that we might look at addressing the very specific barriers to competition. So to economists, we generally find that competition is good and more competition is better. So why is that the case? Why do consumers value choice? It's because they gain power in the economic transaction. If there's only one producer, a monopoly producer can charge a lot more than if there's a competitor out there. And so if I'm willing to pay $10 for a drug, and I'm able to pay $10 for a drug, and they charge me $10 for a drug, that transaction will occur, but I've got no, in economic terms, a consumer surplus. I get no extra benefit out of making this purchase. If the price of drugs fall, and we'll look at how this happens through competition, say to $4, if I'm still willing to pay $10 and only have to pay $4, in economic language, I'd be gaining $6 of consumer surplus. And what we look at is benefits to society. We're going to add up as economists these consumer surpluses, freeing up, as it were, people's incomes to spend on meeting other needs and wants. The FDA actually comes in very handy here because in 2005 they did a very specific study regarding the benefits of competition in the pharmaceutical industry. And what they did was they looked between 1999 and 2004 at average drug prices. And what they did is compared it to the number of competitors in each specific drug market. So if there were 2 drug makers, 3 drug makers, 1 drug maker, 5, 6, they took it out to double digits. And what's interesting when you see the study is every increase, or virtually every increase in the number of competitors in the market resulted in a decrease in prices. The most notable decrease in price came when the second generic entered into the market. And you say, well, why is this the case? Well, let's say that there are, again, just one producer, a monopoly producer, and they raise price. What is the consumer to do? If it's a case of like the EpiPen, where someone's got to have the epinephrine, it's a life or death situation, you're left with little recourse. But you introduce one competitor, and all of a sudden, if the price goes up for one, that competitor has a choice. And they can do one of 2 things. They can either not raise their price and increase their market share and increase their profitability, or given that explicit collusion is illegal, they could still engage in something called price following and start raising their price anyway. When there are smaller numbers of producers in any market, this price following is more common. But again, what the FDA found was it took as little as that third company, the second generic, to virtually wipe away this price following effect and drive prices down in a market. So the key question then is not whether more competition is good or bad. It's a fairly straightforward microeconomic principle that more competition will lead to lower prices for consumers. The question is, where would these barriers to competition arise? Why are we finding in some markets an absence of competitors? We can think about this broadly first. We can think about circumstances that cause a reduction in competition. They might include things like control over scarce inputs. Think about De Beers and control over costume-grade diamonds. And if they've got the diamonds, no one else has the diamonds, they might be able to have some extra market power. I mean, think of IBM at the birth of supercomputers and thinking they had some technological superiority. They knew something that other people didn't know, and so that could give you some advantage. We could think about really high upfront costs. There are not a lot of jumbo jet producers in the world. There's Boeing, there's Airbus, there's 2. And why might that be the case? Well, you'd have to have a company larger than most countries' GDP to even start up a company. The other big one would be if there's economies of scale in production. Think electricity production. Small-scale production wouldn't be cost-efficient. And then finally, the last major barrier to competition comes from government regulations itself. The Senator alluded to some of these in his opening statement. They include patents, licensing rules, and government prohibition on competition. Think in this case, the post office. There's an actual prohibition against competing in the delivery of mail. So when we look at the pharmaceutical industry generally and the EpiPen situation specifically, what we don't see are these big startup costs. Sure, there are some startup costs, but we're not talking Boeing-sized startup costs. Epinephrine has been around for a long time. There's no big scientific reasons, no great technology that's not available to other people. And when we can go one at a time and go through most of the reasons why there is this barrier to competition. It turns out the barrier to competition does exist, but it's coming specifically from that last item, the government regulation. So first of all, there's the patent situation. So again, if there's a reason. If society faces a trade-off. We can offer patents, which gain a company monopoly status, and we know that by giving them monopoly status, that's going to increase their pricing power. And we do it on purpose, and the reason society has decided to do this on purpose is to encourage innovation. If you can't recoup your research and development costs, people will not spend time and money to expand the technological frontier and improve people's lives. The question is not whether we have patents or not patents. The question is the optimal length of patents. And one of the big issues we're facing now in the pharmaceutical industry are patent extensions. So sure, you came up with a great idea at the beginning, but now maybe instead of taking the pill once a day, you can take it twice a week, and is that worthy of patent protection? And what we need to do is look at a trade-off between the value of innovating to a twice-a-week pill or a different delivery mechanism for the epinephrine versus the extra consumer surplus we could generate by extending competition more quickly. The second area then is going to be with licenses. Or in this case, we're thinking FDA approval itself. You have to obtain FDA approval to become a competitor. So when we look at absence of competition in the market, particularly in the face of high prices, you say, well, why aren't there new competitors just jumping in? Again, if there are not huge technical barriers, what's going on? And it turns out there is a very lengthy, as you noted, a process for approval to be a competitor. If we're thinking shoes, if we're thinking shoe store, and the only shoe store in town jacks up the price of shoes, it's a fairly low barrier to start a new shoe store and compete. Or you could have online competition. Here, though, if you had to ask Mother May I from the government, and the government says, well, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, 7 years from now, you might be able to, if you fill out enough paperwork, pay enough between $1 and $5 million in application costs, start a shoe store, you can see how there'd be a lot of shoe stores that have a lot of monopoly status. You would artificially be restricting the number of competitors to the market. So if we were doing this in a logical basis, should the FDA have licensing? Well, you make a good argument for that they want to ensure product safety. And again, we're going to face a trade-off. So product safety is going to be the biggest issue here. And the question is not do we have any approval process, but is 4 years, 5 years, 7 years the appropriate amount, particularly in cases where we already know what the drug does. It's not a new drug. There aren't new side effects. It's the same drug in a generic form. Do there need to be some product tests to make sure that the drug is what it says? Sure, but does that need to take 5, 6, 7 years? Certainly by increasing these, the FDA increasing their cost of getting generics to the market has done a huge disservice to consumer surplus. At a minimum, they should do a cost-benefit analysis and determine in each case, is this going to be the first generic, or is this going to be the 17th generic? I mean, we know from the evidence that the 17th generic does not reduce prices as much in a market as the second, or most notably the third competitor overall, or the second generic. If the FDA is facing scarce resources like we all do, we could hope that they could prioritize to those areas in terms of approving new drugs that will in fact lead to the highest increase in consumer surplus. The last barrier of competition and corresponding policy change is when the government itself regulates the use of an item. And in this case with EpiPen, there were some states and local school districts that mandated specifically it was the EpiPen that had to be stored at the school, and the competitor was not allowed. And when that's the case, you restrict entry into the market. You're not even allowing the competitor to come in and bid down price. So restricting government's ability itself to pick winners and losers, to say you must choose this drug versus that drug, will stand to increase competition and consumer surplus. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next witness is Dr. Scott Gottlieb. He's a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a well-known writer, and a practicing physician. Scott?
And a reformed government bureaucrat, having worked at FDA for a number of years. I want to thank you for having me today, Senator, and the opportunity to testify before the committee. I want to pick up on some of the discussion around the regulatory failures and around the lack of competition. I think that the lack of competition in this market and for the EpiPen product does stem from regulatory failures stemming from FDA policy, and I think that policy can be fixed. The first breakdown, in my view, is just the sort of growing cost and complexity of that FDA approval process. And to give you some statistics on that, for generic drugs that were launched in 2015, it took about 4 years for them to be approved, to go through the FDA process, largely because less than 1% of the applications actually get reviewed and approved on their first cycle. So you have multiple cycling of these generic applications, and often it's over minor issues that don't get to the overall safety and effectiveness of the products. At the same time that the complexity has gone up, so has the cost. And so when I was at FDA, we used to, as a rule of thumb, say that a generic drug application to file and get it through FDA would cost about $1 million, and a category of drugs would have to reach about $10 million in total revenue to be genericized, to have sufficient revenue to make it worth filing that $1 million application. Today, it can cost upwards of $20 million to file a generic drug application. And the general market rule of thumb is that a drug would have to fetch between $25 to $50 million in revenue to justify the investment. And so you have a situation where you have these low utilization products on the market that don't have any competition. Of about 1,300 branded drugs on the market, 10% have lost all patent protection and only have one competitor. And these are some of the high-priced drugs that we've been talking about in the news, drugs like clomipramine, which had an 1,800% price hike from 2013 to 2014, fluconazole, 996% increase over the same year, doxazosin, 1,169% increase. So you have one competitor on the market, they have to amortize the cost of developing that product over a very low volume. There's no competitors coming in trying to drive the price down, and you end up having these big price increases. These problems are compounded when it comes to the class of generics that I would call complex generics or complex drugs. Typically, a complex drug is a drug that has something unusual about its formulation or its mechanism of action that makes it hard to determine that it's the same exact drug as the drug it's trying to copy based on the traditional tests that we require as part of the generic drug process. And so the generic drug process requires what are called bioequivalence and bioavailability studies, which basically means that if you take the drug and you can measure the drug in someone's blood at the same level and in the same proportion as the drug it's trying to copy, you can get approval just on the basis of those tests, just by showing that your drug gets into the blood the same way and stays in the blood for the same length of time. But that was built for a world when drugs were fairly simple chemicals, they were all pills, they were small molecules. In a world where drugs are complex and just merely measuring them in the blood isn't a good approximation of what their benefit might be, it's a lot harder to put those drugs through the traditional generic drug process. So think, for example, of a drug that acts locally, like a metered dose inhaler for asthma. It's acting directly on the lungs, so measuring how much of that drug gets into the blood isn't going to be a good approximation for how it works in the lungs. And in fact, it is the case that we don't have generic competition to some very expensive metered dose inhalers for asthma that have long lost patent protection. Or think of a topical agent like a dermatological cream. If you want to know why old acyclovir costs so much, it's because it's hard to develop a generic formulation of something that acts locally and topically. In the case of EpiPen, it too would fall into this category of complex generics, and the complexity here is the device. It's the product for delivering the drug, the auto-injector. And the problem is that if someone wants to copy EpiPen, the law says that they have to have the exact same instructions for use in their label as EpiPen. But in fact, Mylan has patented some of the unique attributes of their auto-injector that deal with how you would instruct a patient to use it. And so if someone wants to copy EpiPen, they basically have to copy EpiPen's instructions for use, but the instructions for use deal with patented aspects of the auto-injector. But there's a catch-22 here. If someone wants to develop a different auto-injector, different form of epinephrine, a different device, and wants to get approval as a new drug, because they can't go through the generic drug process because they can't copy EpiPen's label, FDA might say to them, actually, we don't think you can be a new drug because you're basically the same ingredient as EpiPen, so you have to go through the generic drug process. And so you can get caught in a catch-22 of sorts, and I think that there are companies caught in this process if you were to ask FDA. So what's the upshot here? I think the generic drug law is a very old law that was written at a time when drugs were very different and were basically simple chemicals. And I think now that we have these categories of complex generics, we might think about changing the law to allow FDA to have more discretion to ask for different complements of information for the purposes of developing generic copies of some of these drugs. And in the case of EpiPen, that might mean allowing a generic copy to EpiPen to have slightly different instructions for use, as long as it's not going to create a patient safety issue. But still be considered a generic formulation of EpiPen and still be substitutable at the point of the pharmacy to provide that kind of price competition that we seek in the market. With that, I'd be happy to answer questions. I appreciate being here.
Thank you. I think we'll save the questions. We'll go around and save the questions. Our next witness is Philip Almeter, who's the Senior Director of Pharmacy, Acute Care Services, and the 340B programs at UK Healthcare here at the University of Kentucky.
Thank you, Senator Paul, for the opportunity to provide testimony regarding the rising prices of medications in the U.S., I am pleased to see that the Help Committee has taken interest in this issue. University of Kentucky's UK Healthcare operates 2 hospitals, several ambulatory clinics, and 6 retail pharmacies, one of which is a specialty pharmacy. In fiscal year 16, we saw 38,000 discharges, 1.29 million outpatient visits, and UK Pharmacy Services dispensed 430,000 outpatient prescriptions. Many of the medication price increases seen recently have affected UK, and in my opinion can be classified into 2 basic groups: direct obvious and indirect less obvious. The direct obvious reasons include increases in innovation, consequences of the FDA's unapproved market drugs initiative, changes in ownership, and the sole source effect. Indirect less obvious reasons are surrounding the pharmacy benefit management impact. The majority of the increases in innovation lies with the specialty pharmacy. In the last 5 years, spend with specialty medications has doubled, contributing to 70% of overall medication spend. The primary drivers for this were therapy developments in hepatitis, autoimmune diseases, and oncology, which accounted for $19.3 billion in increased spend. I believe we will continue to see the cost of many new therapies remain expensive, which have a higher price ceiling than what is seen with non-specialty items. In 2006, the FDA announced its unapproved marketed drugs initiative with the goal of bringing medications that do not currently have FDA approval for marketing into compliance with the approval provisions of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, with one of the goals being to not adversely affect public health, imposing undue burden on consumers, or unnecessarily disrupting the market. My observations are that this new initiative incentivizes manufacturers to put forth R&D dollars for older agents in order to gain market exclusivity. With neostigmine, a medication used to reverse neuromuscular blocking agents used since 1939, UK healthcare has seen the price increase 519% in 3 years. This was started in December 2013 when ECLAT funded studies and gained market approval from the FDA. The FDA allowed other agents to enter the market, and in November 15, the price increased further to 127%. In January, Fresenius Kabi also funded studies receiving market approval. Price increased further in February 2015 to 519%, and it stayed there despite a third manufacturer, Westward, in December of 2015 gaining FDA approval. With vasopressin, a medication used since the 1950s in the treatment of vasodilatory shock, a single manufacturer gained FDA approval in 2014. Since then, the other generic manufacturers have dropped out, leaving only one manufacturer of a critical medication, which puts patients at risk in case of a national shortage. The price increased 3,362% in 2 years, and in the same time period, UK healthcare has spent approximately $650,000 more on this medication. As a result of this initiative, medication spend has increased. However, these are the same medications that we have been using in the hospitals for decades. The change in ownership effect that has been seen with acquisitions of drugs like EpiPen is also impacting medications used specifically in the hospital setting. Nitroprusside saw price increases of 1,745% following Valiant's acquisition of this medication. Calcitonin injection saw a price increase of 1,258%, and then again 3,259% in a period of 2 years following Mylan's acquisition of this medication. Unlike the FDA initiative, these manufacturers have not invested any dollars in R&D. A phenomenon that has been reported in the retail environment over the last 2 years is a sole source effect seen with many generics. These are typically older generic medications that have fallen out of favor due to other novel therapies. As manufacturers leave this market and only 1 or 2 remain, we are seeing skyrocketing price increases. This is impacting many patients who use older generic medications based on their affordability. Potential solutions to these issues include introduced legislation such as Senate Bill S3335, the Fair Drug Price Act of 2016, as well as asking FDA to consider performing an analysis on the market impact of the unapproved marketing drugs initiative thus far. Regarding the PBM impact, during the full House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform hearing on EpiPen, Heather Bresch, CEO of Mylan, stated that although the cost of the 2-pen EpiPen is $608, Mylan only receives $274 net revenue on the transaction. Questions should be asked as to where the remaining $334 go. Lack of transparency will obscure where every dollar goes. However, given the rapidly increasing profits of the larger PBMs, questions should be directed in this direction. PBMs have evolved since the 1970s such that we have seen unprecedented growth and consolidation, decreasing transparency, and conflicts of interest develop with PBM-owned mail-order and specialty pharmacies. Introduced legislation that could improve transparency in this sector of healthcare are House Bill H.R. 244, the MAC Transparency Act, and Senate Bill 3308, Improving Transparency and Accuracy and Medicare Part D Spending Act. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony today.
Thank you. And our final witness, and then we'll have some discussion, is Jim Waters, who's the president of the Bluegrass Policy Institute, the Bluegrass Institute for Public Policy Solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Good afternoon. As Senator Paul said, I'm with the Bluegrass Institute for Public Policy Solutions. We are now celebrating our 13th year. We were founded in 2003 as a state-based free market think tank. You know, whether we're talking about manufacturing or education or healthcare or the development of new drugs, I think it's vital that we do understand that the free market does work when it's allowed to do so. Competition, as we've heard, drives innovation, and perhaps nowhere is that innovation more important than in the area of research and developing drugs that save lives. I'd like to tell a short story that I shared with 1,500 freedom fighters at the State Policy Network to show that while there are risks, and while regulators often claim that they're looking out for us and that they are being compassionate, the consequences of placing unmovable barriers to life-saving drugs is the wrong approach, as it actually does end up costing rather than saving lives. So once upon a time, an eagle's egg was knocked loose from its nest and it rolled down the mountain into a barnyard full of chickens. Intending compassion, these chickens committed to protecting that egg until it hatched, after which they raised this creature not as a beautiful eagle, but as just another chicken who scratched for grub and worms and flittered around the barnyard. One day, a neighbor convinced the farmer who owned these chickens to let him take that eagle up the mountain and see if he could fly. So when that man released him, of course, that innate desire to live free and soar took over, and that majestic bird stretched his wings and flew into the sky. But what if he hadn't? What if he had fallen to the ground and died? Would anyone dare claim that that neighbor had done evil in giving that eagle the opportunity to fly? Should we really have kind of a rope-a-dope drug approval system that says no, even to seriously ill or terminally ill human beings' right to try every option to save their lives, even if in the end it doesn't always work? What if medical missionary Dr. Kent Brantley had died of that humiliating wasting disease of Ebola, even after taking Z-MAP while in Liberia, where he was 6,000 miles from family and utterly alone? Sure, he had a right to know that no human had ever been tested and that it hadn't fully passed all of the FDA safety protocols, which had been going on for years with that drug. But who should have told him that he had no such right to try until some government agency finally got around to approving this drug, even as he stood close enough to death's door at age 33 to push it open? Who had the right to deny Kalamazoo College sophomore Emily Stillman the opportunity to try a vaccine against meningitis that was available but not yet approved by the drug bureaucracy, even after years of testing and trial? Too often, I think that bureaucracy has cried in Chicken Little fashion, the sky might fall, while denying the Emily Stillmans of our world the right to try and save a life, her life, as if that life belonged to some government agency. Yet no government agency blocked Dr. Brantley's access to the experimental Z-MAP and the ensuing miracle which finds him today fully healed and still serving the world's poor and downtrodden. It's a moving story. I mean, don't misunderstand. I'm very happy about what happened to him and for his family, but what about all the others that also had a right to at least try? Who also could have lived a miracle? 1,200 people make it through the FDA's compassionate use application each year, but the process is so complicated, it's very time-consuming and extremely expensive. Plus, the FDA keeps no record of the many, many people who try but who are denied that application. The first step in that process alone is laborious. It requires a physician to complete an application to the FDA that takes around 100 hours just to fill out, after which the manufacturer also must submit lengthy documentation requirements. The FDA then has a month to review the submission and either grant or deny the request, and if there are any questions at all, that 1 month clock starts completely over from the very beginning. And after the FDA approves a request, a separate committee, not affiliated with the FDA, called an institutional review board, also must approve the patient's use of the drug, and this board can also take up to a month to reach a decision. What do you think happens a lot of times during that process? Sadly, there are many documented cases of patients dying while their application is being considered through this process. So while the FDA claims these regulations are needed to protect lives, in the end, they are too often costing lives. And it seems like our government's experimental drug policy seems to have been more about control, about kind of picking and choosing. And I think EpiPen is a great example of this. I mean, here we have a wonderful medical invention, but without the heavy-handed regulatory process currently enforced by the FDA, I'm convinced that other manufacturers would not only create a similar product, but an even better one. Perhaps most disturbing about the EpiPen situation is that the FDA, at least to this point, as we've heard, has limited manufacturing of this life-saving device to pretty much a single company. And the reason they do it, I think, is important to understand. They do it under the guise of ensuring safety. We want to make sure this is safe before we allow other manufacturing of these types of drugs. Yet, this regulatory overreach has not only dramatically increased the price of the product because there's no competition, it also discourages other manufacturers from developing better products. So I think this is cronyism at its worst, favoring a single company while shutting out other firms who would participate, while also discouraging the research and development that would bring new, probably even better drugs to market. So I would ask the question, where's the compassion in forcing drug manufacturers through what amounts to be a 7 to 10 year, up to a $2 billion process for some new drugs, just to get them to the marketplace while people die who are willing to accept the risk of those drugs that may not have completely jumped through all the FDA hoops? It doesn't seem compassionate, and it certainly doesn't seem fair. I mean, what if Dr. Brantley had taken Z-MAP and then died anyhow? What if Emily Stillman had died, even if she had taken the vaccine? Should that risk outweigh the potential of life restored? And I have to ask, should some government agency even be taking the temperature of such a risk with individuals willing to accept that? So an alternative ending to that parable that's often been used tells about how the eagle died in that chicken coop, having never been given the opportunity to try, never knowing that he could fly. Who knows the miracles that await by giving those even at death's crossing the right to know, the right to try, the right to see if they just might soar once again as well. It's happened, you know. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I may have to steal that eagle story sometime. It's pretty good. Jim mentions an ancillary issue, which is the right to try for people who are terminally ill. And there is a bill percolating through, I think, 30 some odd state legislatures now passed it, and I'm a co-sponsor of it in the Congress, and that we are trying to get that through as well. And we had some moving testimony from some patients with ALS, and one of the points that they made was that a lot of treatment for new disease may well be specifically targeted to you and to the genetic mutation you have. I think there's said to be over 20 different mutations for ALS. It's not all the same disease. That perhaps maybe you're going to go to a lab and someday they're going to draw your blood, look at your chromosomes, look at your genetic defect, and they can't do a 1,000-person clinical trial on it because the treatment's going to be for you. Which kind of goes to Dr. Gottlieb's point, is that maybe we have to look at our criteria. Maybe what we used to do 20 years ago shouldn't be the same. But I think that one of the most important things is when we're unhappy about something, that we look for the root cause and we don't blame the wrong person. So we're all unhappy, uniformly unhappy at how the price went up by 500%, but there's a couple different reactions. We could say, well, we need price controls. We just need to tell the companies they can only charge $100. But price controls were the disaster that brought down the Soviet Union, and they're the disaster that leads to poverty under socialism. So I think what we have to say, well, was this a free market? Was this really capitalism, as Dr. Strauss Kyle was saying. And are there barriers to entry that are government? Are some barriers acceptable? Are we going to let the government be involved in some safety and efficacy? Probably yes, but can they go too far? You know, the FDA, when we brought them in, they said to us, oh, you fixed this a year ago. You know, we passed some reforms about a year ago. And they said, oh, we're doing a lot better now. And I said, well, it's been 7 years. How about the EpiPen alternative? And there are a lot of technical questions, and when you try to dig into this, if you bring the generic manufacturer in of any of these things, they're afraid to talk to us, because if I publicly state what any of the generic people are talking about, which they're allowed to tell me, they're afraid the FDA will punish them and will never approve their process. And so we ask the FDA, and they say it's proprietary. We can't tell you any information about the applications. But it takes about 3.7 times for the application to go to the FDA, come back, go to the FDA, come back. And 7 years is just frankly unacceptable. And so I think we do need to fix the system. And I think with regard to EpiPen, it's both looking at people finagling or manipulating the patent system, and then it's also looking at speeding up the entry of new drugs into the marketplace, not only new drugs, but generic drugs. And one of the things that I'd like to ask Dr. Gottlieb would be with regard to, we had these reforms, and I know you understand the reforms. Do you think the reforms were enough? Do you think the FDA is doing a better job? There's some indication the application time may not have gotten shorter since the reforms, but they tell us one thing, and then we look at the statistics, and it doesn't necessarily seem to be better.
Yeah, I think the statistics are getting better because they're cycling. They're trying to address the cycling, but the overall length of time that it takes to review an application hasn't really gone down. So they're reviewing more applications, they're getting more applications done within a certain time frame, but they're still having these multiple cycles, and it's still taking a lot of years to get an application through. And I think it's also too early to tell what impact the generic drug user fee law had on the process. It certainly gave them more resources. I think with respect to this particular issue, though, there hasn't been anything that's resolved this issue of these complex formulations. And these, frankly, end up being a lot of the new and more innovative drugs and a lot of very important drugs. And there have been other cases where there have been drugs where patents are long since lapsed, and FDA has struggled to approve generic versions to those drugs. A classic example recently was Lovenox. The Lovenox patents were up for 2 or 3 years, and FDA was fumbling trying to get the generic entrance through the generic drug approval process. And I think it relates back to, again, trying to fit these complex drugs through that old abbreviated new drug application, that old generic drug process. When I was at FDA, we were just starting to think about how we were going to approve generic copies of biosimilar drugs, and the FDA staff were arguing that they didn't need Congress to do anything, they didn't need new legislation, they can approve generic copies of biological drugs through a pathway called 505(b)(2) that existed. Well, it turns out Congress did legislate, and thankfully, because if the FDA was struggling to try to approve these biologics through their traditional pathway or some nuance in the authorities that they thought they had, it wouldn't have gone as smoothly. And I think the same thing is operative here. The FDA will argue that they don't need new authority to deal with these complex drugs, yet they keep making mistakes when it comes to trying to introduce competition. And they argue they can put it through their traditional process, but in fact, they haven't been successful at doing that. And I think that this is a ripe opportunity for Congress to look at this whole category to the extent that the category itself can be defined, and I think it can, and think of a sort of generic plus type of approval process that's a little different than the traditional process, but allows these drugs to enter the market more quickly.
Going back to whether or not this is, broken capitalism, or whether this is cronyism, or what we should do, some will propose that we just need to cap the price, and have price controls on drugs, and that somehow that's the answer. Dr. Stroud, do you think this is a breakdown of capitalism, or do you think this is artificial barriers to entry from the government? What do you think of price controls?
Price controls generally make me squeamish, but I'm going to come back to that. I'm just going to start with the simple answer of yes, it's largely due to barriers to entry.
Governmental barriers.
Governmental barriers to entry. So specifically, let's imagine a race. The gun's about to go off. We've got epinephrine or the EpiPen in one lane and a potential competitor in the next. The gun goes off. EpiPen takes off down the track, and you physically restrain the competitor and say, you can't go yet, you have to start an FDA approval process, and 4 to 7 years down the line, we'll let you start running the race. You might imagine who's going to win that race at a minimum, not just 4 to 7 years, but for some time after that. Well, the thing is, with the patent system, we know when that gun's supposed to go off. We know when the patent expires, and we can go back to arguing about whether or not we should extend patents, but we do know when the patent expires. And if we know that's when the race can start between the brand name and the generic guys, why don't we let the generic guys go through all the product testing before the gun goes off? Why don't we hit it when the gun goes off, everyone gets to run? That would dramatically increase the role of generics in the market and bring them to market more quickly. I mean, the overarching question we have to ask is, does the FDA care about drug prices? I mean, we can argue that the reason they're set up is solely for drug safety. And if you're only looking at one end of the spectrum, then it's always going to be in their incentive to have the safest possible thing, which is safety is good, but they're not taking account of the trade-offs. The question is, in their charter itself, should they be forced to consider safety at what cost? I mean, all kinds of levels of government have to do cost-benefit analysis, and FDA, I don't think, should be immune from that. So the question on price, go ahead.
No,
I was
go ahead.
going to hit on price controls. Price controls, I mean, let's take it two scenarios. One scenario, you're going to put price controls on for something that's patented. Well, you just undid the patent protection. I mean, by another form, you either have a monopoly right to sell the product or you don't. But if you come in on the backside and say, yeah, we'll give you a patent, but wink, wink, nod, nod, we're going to tell you what to charge, then no longer is that incentive to innovate in existence in the first place. And so you'd be effectively getting rid of the patent system. Now, the second question is, do you want price controls for things that aren't subject to patents? And then the question becomes, well, where's, again, the role of competition? Why would you need a price ceiling if new entrants could come in? I mean, we see from evidence in the drug industry itself, from the FDA, the evidence that they have collected, that when you allow the competition to happen, the competition does materialize and drug prices do fall. So it'd be a solution in search of a problem.
You know, I like the idea of maybe starting the generic application process before it expires. So if it's going to take you 4 years, if you took your 4 years before it expires, wouldn't be as much a complaint. But the other thing is that we also, all of us essentially acknowledge that we are not against patents and that we like the innovation that patents allow. What about also, particularly if we're going to reform this in ways drug companies may not like, but if you reform it such that you speed up the process of getting the patent and getting the approval, then they have a longer period of time to enjoy their patent protection. So you could speed it up on the tail end, the transition to generics, but you could also speed it up on the front end so they can make more money on the front end if they can get their FDA approval sooner, which sooner FDA approval, if done properly, is what we want, is life-saving drugs more quickly on the market. Does anybody else have a comment on Dr. Strauss' comment on letting the generic application process start earlier? And it doesn't start now, right? You have to wait to the end to file any paperwork?
I think that would have a huge impact considering 90% of all medicines filled in the United States are generic. So beginning that process earlier would certainly affect in a positive way, I think, a lot of people.
And the next question, I kind of wanted to broaden the debate beyond EpiPen because Philip Almeter mentioned several of the drugs. So did Dr. Gottlieb, of all the different drugs. This isn't a one drug thing. There's a host of these, and many of them in the generic sphere. Now, sometimes we will ask, why did everybody go out of business? And we get these vague things like voluntary recall or manufacturing problem. And what I'm wondering is, and Scott may know this more than anybody else, is are they sometimes being told quietly by the FDA, you're going to get a public punishment, you can voluntarily do this, or you can say manufacturing problem, but in reality it's the FDA that is shutting them down by saying you didn't pass a certain inspection. Our understanding is in the last couple of years, did something change to make it worse? Are there stepped up investigations that are maybe nitpicking that really aren't going to the safety issue but are overwhelming some of the drug production, and then all of a sudden we have no competitor because of an inspection process?
Right. Well, it is the case that FDA dramatically changed its enforcement standard with respect to what we call good manufacturing practices, or GMPs, as they apply to the generic drug industry. out of a perception, not entirely untrue, that the generic industry was operating at a different standard, in some cases a lower standard than the branded industry, and they wanted to bring everyone up to the same standard. But they did that in a fashion where they went into these generic manufacturing plants and issued what we call 483s, which are findings of deficiencies. And the 483s become public, and they create liability for the companies. And so if a company continues to operate a plant after it's received a sanction from the FDA saying that the plant is deficient in some significant way, that's a hard position to put a company in and for the company to continue operating in. And so what happened was they did this, and they knocked off the market 25% of the parenteral drug manufacturing in the United States. And by parenteral drug, I mean injected drugs. And these are a lot of the drugs that have been in shortage and where the prices have gone up. Last year, we almost had a shortage of saline, of normal saline in this country because they knocked the
Do you think
plants.
that was a reaction to the contaminated steroid injections that happened from the company, up in Massachusetts or something, or?
I think it's actually the opposite. They did this prior to what happened in Massachusetts, and I think once these shortages were created by FDA for the branded drugs, more of the market shifted towards the compounded drugs, and that's why the utilization of the compounded drugs spiked. And so the FDA, by trying to address a risk in one context, actually increased the overall public health risk because more of the market shifted to less regulated products, the compounded products in the case that you referenced. Now, a lot of that manufacturing is now coming back online, but the FDA has still imposed requirements on the generic manufacturers that are much costlier than what they used to be. So, for example, a generic manufacturing plant might produce hundreds of drugs in a plant and literally dozens on a single manufacturing line. The branded industry might produce a single drug or two on a manufacturing line. FDA is increasingly saying we want only a few drugs produced on a manufacturing line because it makes it easier for them to oversee that manufacturing line. But that's also very expensive, and it's not the expense at which the generic drug industry has traditionally operated, and so it's increasing the cost of the manufacturing. When you increase the cost of manufacturing a pill that used to cost 2 cents and now it costs 3 or 4 cents to manufacture, that's a 100% or 200% price increase. And so there's a cost of goods component here as a result of the regulatory increase that's contributing to the price increases that we're seeing in the market.
Right. And so I guess what we have to look at is in the mission that the FDA is given, are they going in and have we increased inspections that are shutting down plants because of a problem? Or are we doing it just because of a increased zealousness that we have decided that we want to inspect these and that perhaps it isn't improving safety, they've made a unilateral decision without a real problem?
Right. So my view has been it's a little bit of both, obviously, and there are situations where the FDA is on very firm ground in terms of shutting down a manufacturing facility. But I think the larger problem is that there's a disconnect between the FDA field force that goes in and inspects these plants and issues these public findings and the policymakers back at FDA, the career staff who are more sensitive to considerations of what the real public health risk would be in allowing a plant to manufacture in some subpar state versus taking the manufacturing offline and creating unintended consequences. And the policymakers in FDA have a very hard time getting control over the field force. The field force operates as sort of independent law enforcement units and don't really respond to those policy prerogatives. And so they'll go in and shut a plant down, even if the policymakers might say, look, we would rather that plant continue to operate under close supervision while they remediate themselves because we don't want to precipitate a shortage that might force doctors and patients to have to use a compounded alternative that we know is a lot less safe. But that kind of teaming of those two regulatory pieces of FDA isn't happening. The only place it is happening is on the biologic side, and that's in large measure because after we had those shortages of the flu vaccine that you'll remember, you saw long lines in Florida because the FDA shut down some flu vaccine manufacturers right before flu season. CBER, the Center for Biologics, adopted what they called team biologics, where they basically forced the field force and the review staff to work together on these inspections. And so you had inspections happen that were much more sensitive to what some of the potential consequences would be of shutting down a facility. That's not happening as much on the drug side. So you're seeing unilateral decisions taken by the field force to shut certain facilities or force their shuttering. And then the consequences are felt by the career staff at FDA who worry about the unintended consequences.
I want to go back briefly to what Dr. Gottlieb said earlier. Neither side will tell us, the FDA or the people making the generics, exactly why it hadn't been approved, but there are articles out there saying that it's not enough the same. And so the question I asked the FDA, what does that mean? Have you defined a sameness standard? And they said, we're working on it. So companies gone through 7 years and being denied, there is no written standard of what the same means. And so I say, does it inject 0.3 milligrams the same as the EpiPen? Well, they won't tell you that either, but I think the answer is yes. So I think it works. It injects the proper dose. It's not harming anybody, but it may be the instructions aren't exactly the same. And it's like, are you telling me that if the spring that launches the needle is a right-handed spring versus a left-handed spring, that it wouldn't be the same? And they're like, essentially, yes. They can, it's a distinction without a difference that we're stopping things. So they're screwing up a whole marketplace, making us wait 7 years for competition based on something that actually works. And the catch-22 is, they're saying it's not enough the same, but if it's different, then give them a patent. Give them a patent for a brand-new device, but then they'll be sued also. So what happens is every time a generic wants to come on the market, they immediately get sued by the patented every time. And then there's a 30-month waiting period. So we're looking at maybe shortening the 30-month waiting period. If they're going to sue them every time, why don't we shorten it and make it 12 months or 15 months? But I'm of the belief that we need more oversight of the FDA. And the last time around, they want to put soft words in for the FDA like they may do something. And I want to say that they shall do something. I think they need more oversight from us because left to their own devices, they don't have a good track record history. I guess you could argue that for safety, we have done a pretty good job in our country. But I wanted to see if anybody else knew anything about the tetracycline problem or some of these other drugs. And maybe, Philip, you can comment on this. But they say there's a shortage of the base ingredients going into tetracycline. And I don't see a shortage in any other marketplace. I don't understand how when you order it, if you go to Walmart and you take a water off there and you scan it, they know it's gone and they order more water, unless it's a diamond or something, and there's a shortage of tetracycline used to be for pennies. A mother told me the other day it cost her $1,200 for 1 month's supply for her kids. I think it's doxycycline or minocycline, but a tetracycline, it's been generic for 50 years probably. Even the derivatives are generic. Do you have any comment on the tetracycline?
No, the tetracycline shortages really occurred in 2011, and that's when we saw the shortages spike across. I mean, hospitals were opening their totes in the morning and not seeing drugs in their totes.
Has the price come back down or not?
It hasn't. So in January of 2011, it was $6.76 a bottle for the 500 milligram capsules. And then in January of 13, it was 900, and then in June of 2015, it's now $1,260 a bottle. There's only two manufacturers, Watson and Teva, but nothing else has changed. It was short due to raw ingredients at the time, but nothing else has really changed with the
But see, I hear that, and I'm not sure my warning signals of being suspicious about what I'm being told. Shortage of supply. Why? Does anybody know?
Well,
I was going to say your question earlier to Scott regarding what's the message that pharmacies hear when something's unavailable.
Right.
The example I gave earlier with the FDA unapproved with vasopressin and neostigmine, all we saw was messages from our wholesaler saying shortage issue, manufacturer supply issue. There was none of the details behind the scenes of X manufacturer got approval and we're getting pressure to get out of here. We're going to have fines put on us.
Right.
And so you have to do a lot of digging. You have to ask representatives. They don't want to talk. So a lot of it you have to wait till it comes out in the news.
It's opaque. There isn't a transparency, and some of it's this idea of proprietary knowledge. So we're not hearing it from either side. One side's afraid of the FDA. The FDA says, and I understand the proprietary rules, we can't tell you anything about it. But like on the sameness thing, how do we fix that? The FDA is feeling some pressure now. They're going to actually define sameness. But I ask them the same. Some of these EpiPens have said it was a dosage problem. Well, I want to know how far off it was. I know what a standard of error is. I want to know, was it doing 0.31? Was it harming anybody? What's the range? Can it go from 0.295 to 0.305? What is the range? But even that, they said, we kind of have that, but they didn't seem to be very easy and forthcoming with it. And then I asked them the question, well, did the EpiPen, what was its standard of error? But that's not really what you're comparing to. You're having to do new studies where you compare yourself to the EpiPen. But the EpiPen may not have had, why wouldn't you compare it to an original study that if EpiPen does 0.3 and it has a range of error on its injection, that would be the standard you'd go by. But that apparently is not true. I think you have to go by new studies where you compare yourself to EpiPen, right?
And to your point initially about the patent issue, Mylan was clever in this circumstance. They patented aspects of the auto-injector that deal with how the auto-injector itself is used. So they created unique instructions for use for their auto-injector and then patented the aspects of their product that deal with those instructions for use.
Maybe we should stop that. I mean, stop allowing a patent for that, because there is some discussion. Like I remember in ophthalmology, some guy patented the frown incision. We used to do the smile. He turned it upside down as a frown, and everybody got made fun of somewhat. But I think he actually got a patent. Maybe you shouldn't be able to get a patent for instructions.
Just change the regulatory standard, because the regulatory standard right now is if it requires any retraining by the patient, then it can't be a generic alternative. But I would argue as a clinician, a little bit of retraining, if it's self-explanatory to the patient, might be permissible, might be perfectly fine, and isn't going to confuse the end user. And so maybe we provide a little more flexibility there.
Right. One other thing I'd like to say, and then we're also open for a couple more questions and responses here, is that I'm a big believer in you try to figure out the problem. You don't just get angry and put price controls on. You figure out the problem, and this is a complicated issue, and then we figure out how to fix it. All of you have taken the time to come and testify. I know many of you had to drive hours or come from other states, and I appreciate that. We want to find the solution. So if any of you are willing to continue to work with our office, several bills were mentioned, and we know about some of those, and we will continue to look at those. But also, we'll be looking at a solution. I'm going to work with the chairman, Alexander, to try to find a solution to this. And as this comes forward, it may take 6 months, it may take a year, but we want to actually try to fix some of this stuff. Maybe we don't patent labeling, maybe we define, if they tell us what they think sameness is, maybe we tell them, no, this is what it should be. And when they say there are manufacturing issues, we'd say, have you pushed them out of the market? Do we make it easier when there's one supplier? If someone gobbles up all the suppliers, should we make it easier? Apparently, they do have a special route for drugs to come in to be imported if there is said to be a shortage, but they don't have it for single supplier. Maybe we should do it for single supplier. Some of this has to do with drugs coming across, foreign boundaries, which maybe we should enhance. We're not the only civilized country in the world. Europe, Asia, there's a lot of places that do testing. Should we not have a more international system of trying to approve drugs? But does anybody have another comment on any of the issues or want to make any other statement?
Well, I'm concerned that we discourage the continuation of research and development by, with barriers. I mean, part of our system is trial and error a lot of times. I know in the development of these drugs, sometimes you don't always get it on the first swing. You don't always hit it. So, the companies have to be encouraged to continue to research that, and I think maybe a lot of these regulatory barriers have been detriments to that part of the process that we don't see.
I think we're going to conclude, but I talked to Courtney earlier, and if you'll would you mind just standing up and tell us who you are and a little bit about your kids and their problems?
My name is Courtney Teray, and these are my three kids. Two of them have food allergies and require an EpiPen. And I've been with Laura Jackson's email group. I haven't been to many meetings, but I've followed this closely. I think that the main concern is the unexplained price increase. And we switched over to the ABQ, and it was great because I have a teenager
Thank you. And it reminded me of one more question for Philip. The one that's out there is Adrenaclix. Is Adrenaclix significantly cheaper for you at the hospital than EpiPen?
Well, the one that, what we use at the hospital costs a few dollars because we use a vial, and we're giving it in a code situation intravenously. But
So you're not using it. You're not using an
in the
auto-injector.
retail environment. We are buying the generic, as well as the brand. I guess it depends on the plan and the payer. What the patient.
It's
can afford.
complicated to figure
The
out
list
whether
on
it's a different
Adrenaclix
price.
$140, the list price.
Yeah.
It's about $400 for us to buy.
The Adrenaclick is $400?
Adrenaclick is about
For-
$400.
Which gets to the whole other question of there's 10 different prices and it's so confusing, and then there's rebates for big purchasers, et cetera, et cetera. But for you, you say the price is not that much different?
No, it's about 8% cheaper for the generic.
Right. But I think what's happening is he's a much bigger purchaser than you.
Sure.
And so they're probably EpiPen's offering a steeper discount to try to get you to use it. But there's not enough differential for you to even, if you have a differential in the hospital, will you try to encourage your physicians to order cheaper varieties if you think they're equivalent?
It's really dictated by the plan. It's really what
By
it's
the plan
dictated.
more than the physician.
Yeah, it really is. And it's, as a safety net provider, when they can't afford it, and I will just say this, as UK Healthcare, we're a safety net provider. We have to get the drug to the patient. If they can't afford it, we will use our dollars to
Right.
give it away for free. So
Some of the published material also said that Adrenaclick was not therapeutically equivalent to EpiPen. Does anybody know what that means? I mean, I know what it means, but why they're saying that?
is that, I think my understanding is it has to do with AB rating. If you look at the rating, it's a BX rating, and they won't say that they're they're perfectly bioequivalent.
It's not substitutable, but it would have to do with the device, not the drug inside the device.
So
It's
once
not a
again,
generic.
sort of a distinction without a difference. I
Yeah.
mean, it gives the same dose, and it
Right.
probably works equally as well. And you could debate which one works easier or better. But I think by saying that, I think what's happened on some insurance plans is some insurance plans have listed it as a second tier where they would rather you get the other one because it's the gold standard, and this is not therapeutically
Or
equivalent.
they get a bigger rebate with that one.
Exactly, and that's another problem we're going to look into as well. But I think we've gotten a lot of answers today, and we're going to keep looking into it. We want to keep in contact with you. If you'll keep in contact with us, and we'd appreciate any of your feedback. Thanks, everybody. I think I'm supposed to adjourn. Testimony today will be, and you have 10 days to submit anything else. Thank you for being here today, and the committee will stand adjourned.